Good day, folks. I'm Jason Groom with Redarc, and on today's workshop, we're going to teach you the proper method for building and installing a proper power management system for secondary batteries on a vehicle. The most important step in building a proper system is not the chargers, it's not the batteries, it's in finding out what you're actually going to power. Remember, this vehicle is going to be off grid. You don't want to run a generator. You can only start it when you're either driving. You don't want to be starting it at the campsite. And you're going to have solar. So outside of that, you're really going to have no other way of powering this. So we need to figure out the wattage or the amps that we're going to be using, especially in the evening. I call these the witching hours. So when I look at when there's no sun, because if I'm talking about charging via the vehicle or charging via solar, there's about 12 hours or so where I don't want to do either of those because the sun, let's say from 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock, there's no real available sunlight for solar, and you're not going to start your engine. So this is where you begin in sizing the system. I like to speak in amps. They're little numbers to me. The little squirrel up here handles them better than the large watt numbers. If you can easily transfer from the watts to the amps. Just take the wattage, divide it by the volts, and that'll give you the amps. So let's say, prime example, you heard of a 1200 watt battery. It's a 12 volt battery. That's a 100 amp hour battery. So you have a 1200 watt divided by the 12 volts gets us to the amps. So now that we have that behind us, I'm going to continue this in amps. And of course, when we're talking amps, that's how many amps will be burned in 1 hour of time or used from the system. So if I have a refrigerator that I need to power during that 12-hour period, a refrigerator, when it's cycling a DC refrigerator, it might use 5 amps of power when it's cycling, but it's not always cycling unless you leave the refrigerator open. Let's call that 2 amps. So this isn't exact math, but it's good enough to get you the general design of what you're doing with the system without spending a whole lot of time and effort trying to get it right down to that decimal point of amps. You don't need to do that. So if we call that 2 amps per hour, which is guessing on the higher side of things, I know in that 12 hours, I'm going to burn 24 amps of power, meaning that minimum battery size has to be 24 amps of lithium and almost 48 amps if lead acid or AGM, because AGM lead acid, you can only use about 1/2 of what the vehicle or that battery amperage rating is, where lithium, you can use basically the whole amount. But then let's continue on what we were speaking of on this witching hour. So maybe I have a couple LEDs. Maybe they're running 1 or 2 amps each, and they'll be on for a while. Maybe I'm charging a computer. That can be close to 17 amps. So anyway, the whole point of this is you're going to be adding up everything that might be running during that 12-hour period. If you have, or the customer has, a CPAP machine, they average about 6 amps per hour. Now, unless you're a really great sleeper while you're camping, you're not going to sleep for 12 hours. I mean, that's a lot of fun around the campfire if you're able to sleep for 12 hours. Generally, you might add that up for 6 hours. But I think you get the point of this. You're just adding up everything that you're going to use over that 12-hour witching period where power is going down and you have no way to charge it back up. That's how you figure out a battery size. And that's a minimum battery size. So anything happens in your power, if you go up in power needs for that, and you just sized it to exactly what you just added up to, that customer is going to run out of power and be unhappy with the system. So rule of thumb is if you have the funds to do it and the means to do it, it's generally a good idea to double whatever that power usage was overnight. So in a lot of scenarios, that usage might be like 25 to 50 amps, total 50 amps being on the high side. It's very common for folks that are doing off-grid to start with a 100 amp hour lithium battery. And of course, later on, if they find that you size the battery incorrectly, you can always put them in parallel, positive, positive, negative, negative, to double the amps while maintaining that 12-volt system. So now that you have an idea of the battery size that's going into the system build, let's talk about the charger. So it used to be battery manufacturers would want you to charge at about a 25% charging rate for the amperage size of the battery. So thus a 100 amp hour battery, they'd suggest a 25 amp charger. It's still probably the best for the battery to charge at that rate. However, for longevity purposes. But however, now battery manufacturers say that you can safely charge at a 40 or 50% rate. So in our scenario, now I can pair up a 40 amp DC to DC charger or a 50 amp DC to DC charger, which would charge that battery all the way back up much faster than the 25% rate, figuring that with a dead 100 or a flat 100 amp hour battery, the 25 amp charger would take up to 4 hours of driving. The 40 amp charger would take 2.5 hours of driving, and the 50 amp would get that battery fully charged within 2 hours if it was completely dead. So, of course, not all the time are you going to be driving every day from campsite to campsite and then setting up again, so able to charge while you're driving. Many times you're going to want to stay at the same site for multiple days. So I like to call this the wash, rinse, repeat. So we go through the witching hours at night, and then we have to gain that power back during the daytime hours without running the engine, and then start that whole scenario over again the next night and during the day again. So wash, rinse, repeat. So the only way we can do this is now bringing solar into the equation. Solar is what makes it possible for the customer to stay on site without running the engine, without running a generator and plugging into shore power. So a rule of thumb is for every 100 watts of solar panel, you're going to receive about 5 to 6 amps of charging in bright sunlight. So looking at this, if I go back to my scenario, let's say we burn 50 amp hours over the course of the evening in those 12 hours of witching hours, as I like to call it. If I have a 100-watt panel, it would take me 10 hours of bright sunlight to get that, roughly, to get that power back into the battery. The chances of that happening, probably not. You're probably not going to have 12 hours of constant sunlight to charge yourself back up. However, the nice thing about solar panels, they can also be put in parallel. So positive, positive, negative, negative, you can put solar panels together. And the beauty of solar panels is, unlike batteries where you need to have the exact chemistry and size of battery in order to put them in parallel, solar panels can be different sizes. You can put a 100-watt panel with a 200-watt panel with a 300. So if you have rigid panels on top of the roof, you can throw out a portable panel. That's perfectly fine as long as they're all in parallel. And what that does is it just combines that wattage using the same equation. We're going to get 5 or 6 amps per every 100 watts of solar panel. So now if I put 200 watts of solar, I'm getting 10 or 12 amps of power during the day. And that allows me to shorten that time that it will take to fully recharge that battery from the 10 hours to 5 hours. Now I'm getting it more feasible. Now, granted, this is getting in the weeds a little bit. I do have to keep into account that my refrigerator is still going to be running during that daytime, during the daylight hours, and I might have another few loads running during that hours. Just kind of keep those in consideration because they will take down the amount of solar charging you're getting. So again, rule of thumb is the more solar you can pack into it. If I'm at 300 or 400 watts of solar, every time I add another 100 watts, that's 5 or 6 amps more I'm getting every hour. But it's as simple as that as far as building out the needs for the charger and the needs for solar to do my famous wash, rinse, repeat, and stay on site and be able to be off grid pretty much indefinitely. So now that we've gone over sizing a system based on power demands, charger sizes based on battery size from our power demands, and how solar fits into the equation, we can now get into what Redarc would call our total vehicle management systems, which consist of the Manager 30, which is behind me on my left shoulder, and we'll also have a diagram up on the screen. That is a DC to DC charger with the solar controller built in. Again, the maximum power point tracking controller, which allows for charging of lithium batteries, gel, AGM, whatever type of battery you may need to charge. It also consists of the distribution box, or what in this case we would call our Rogue. And this allows you to turn on and off 10 different input channels as far as loads go, for lights, for pumps, for heaters, for whatever the case may be. It would have 10 amp resettable breaker internal breakers in this for the loads. It also has the ability to do dimming on 8 separate loads themselves. So if you want to dim some lights, you're able to do that. You can also set trigger points. So let's say I don't have my mobile phone, because of course all of these products have the ability, or all the total vehicle management system products have the ability to have an app, so you can turn things on and off via the phone and do all the monitoring via your phone as well, or the color display. So if I don't have either of those handy, and let's say I have a little barbecue outside of my overland trailer, or wherever the case may be in that, and there's a switch out there, that trigger point allows that switch to be kind of like a three-way switch in the house. I can control it via the display, I can control it via my mobile phone, or I can utilize that switch. We can also do master switches, where if I turn the ignition on a vehicle, maybe it shuts everything off except the refrigerator. So all that is available within our total vehicle management systems. And the color display is nice because it shows you exactly what is going on with your power. You know exactly what percentage of battery life you have left. You know if you're in a state of charge or discharge on that battery. And if so, how many amps are going in and out of that battery? How many amps are coming from the charger? How many are going out to loads? How many days or hours you have left off grid with your current power demands before you have to think about either turning off loads or doing something to get more charging back into the system. So it's really peace of mind. I like to say that you wouldn't go out and drive a car without a fuel gauge. That's exactly what this provides. Now, granted, in the old motorcycle days, we did a lot of pushing because motorcycles didn't have them, but you don't want your power system to not have all this vital information that's readily available, as far as even how many watts of solar you've received over the day, so you can get an idea if your solar array is working correctly. You can see power performance over a week, over a month, how your solar's performed over the week. All this is available in our total vehicle management system. And you're looking at the main charging unit, one distribution box, and a color Bluetooth display. It's as simple as that. So getting a little bit into the installation without getting too far into the weeds. Installation for these products would be very simple, especially for a 12-volt expert. If you're looking at one of our standard DC to DC chargers, which we call our BCDC series, seems to be a few wires here, nothing to worry about. If I'm taking this red wire here, this is the power input to the charger, which would hook directly to my start vehicle battery. So the vehicle start battery, going through a fuse, of course, because we all know about fusing. It's very important when you're doing an installation. Let's take example, a 25 amp charger. I'd have a 40 amp. We believe in MIDI fuses. We find they have the best performance with constant charging. We do not recommend breakers because breakers tend to get hot when they're under a constant current load. So there would be a 40 amp fuse for this 25 amp charger. The red wire would be the input into the charger. The black wire is the common ground for the entire vehicle. So as you know from years of experience, whenever there's a problem, most likely it is the ground. It is not a common ground that is used for the entire chassis of that vehicle. That is what we're hooking to here. So now I've just got a few main wires left. This brown wire here on a DC to DC charger would be the charge wire to the house battery, auxiliary battery, whatever your terminology might be for that. This is going to do the profile charging of the auxiliary battery at the 25 amp threshold. There would also be a 40 amp, again, MIDI fuse that would go here right before the positive of the post. Now, Redarc does make a kit that comes with 2 fuse holders and 4 fuses, so 2 extra fuses just in case, all sold in one package for this installation. This yellow wire here, this is simply the positive for the solar controller, for that maximum power point tracking controller that is inside this unit. You would hook the positive terminal of that solar panel directly to this wire, and then the black, of course, or the negative from that solar panel would go directly to the chassis ground, the same ground used for everything else in the vehicle. So that's leaving only 3 wires left in this particular system. So current version of the DC-DC charger, which I have here, instead of setting the profiles for the battery in a digital manner, we are doing that analog style. So if I have these 2 wires like this, I'm putting a lead acid battery into my system for charging. If I put them together, now I'm using a lithium battery as far as my auxiliary goes. Ground one, I have gel. Ground the other, it's AGM, leaving us with only 1 other wire for this complete installation. So we're almost done. It took no time at all to do this. For newer vehicles, so pretty much almost any vehicle that you'll be working on, if it's 2000, let's say 12, 2015 and above, it's going to have something either called a temperature rated or regulated or a smart alternator. So basically what happens is when driving, the voltage will drop in the whole system in order to preserve a little bit of fuel economy. And what that does is that it confuses a charger into thinking that there's a problem with the battery level on the start vehicle going down too low, and it doesn't want to pull power from it because it wants to make sure you can always start the vehicle. This blue wire alleviates anything with the smart alternator. Basically what you're doing is you are just hooking this up to anything that comes on when the vehicle's on it, an ignition source. It could be running lights, it could be the entertainment center, anything that comes on there when the key is turned, and that solves that problem. So that is the full hookup for one of our basic DC to DC systems, our BCDCs. And then when it comes into the management systems, yeah, there's a bit more wiring. This would be for our TVMS Rogue. And basically here are your 10 inputs in and out for your loads that you're going to be switching on and off via that display, or that you'll be switching via your mobile device. They have, each one has 5, and there's a positive and a negative. The nice thing is you don't necessarily have to run the extra wiring for all the negatives to the negatives. You can just put the negatives to a common ground. The only time you do have to use the negative on the actual connector, automotive grade connector, instead of just running it to a common ground, is if you're using the dimming feature on that. So if you're using the dimming feature, we do want you to run the negative to this as well. And then that would simply clip into the unit itself. And it would be the same thing for the other 5. Easy for me to do, but you kind of get the gist. Boy, that was painful, huh? But you're a professional. You'll do better than that. So then on this particular loom here, there's 2 sensors, because you can actually have 2 different tank level sensors for water or fuel or anything like that. There's 2 sensors. There's the 8 the 8 triggers that I talked about earlier, where you can actually set the trigger points for if you open a door or turn on ignition, something happens with some of the loads on there. And they would just connect to these looms, and that would plug back into the system. The same thing for our chargers. We use very easy automotive style, just standard like you probably see on amplifiers and different electronics you're already dealing with. You would simply put the bare wire in, and you would screw down on the screw to hold that tight, and that is the connection, and that would just pop right into the unit itself. That's how all of our connections are. And then when it comes to all these items speaking with each other, we do a CAN bus daisy chain. So you can put as many screens on it. It's just an RJ45 cabling that would go from one unit to the other, so everybody can talk to each other, including the Redarc power inverters will talk with our Red Vision or TVMS systems. Thank you very much for tuning into today's workshop. We appreciate your time in watching all this. If you'd like to learn more about Redarc total vehicle management systems, please come visit our website at redarcelectronics.com. See you next time.